Have you ever prayed for something with everything you had, your whole heart, your deepest faith, only to be met with absolute, crushing silence? For 20 years, an aging architect believed heaven had abandoned him. He had begged for the commission of a lifetime, a project he was certain would be his divine legacy. Instead, the door was slammed shut, and the prize was handed to his greatest rival. His community whispered that he lacked faith. Defeated, he locked his prayers away in a drawer, carrying the quiet, heavy shame of a man who felt ignored by God. But what happens when time finally strips away the surface of our greatest disappointments? What if the closed door you've been banging your fists against wasn't a punishment, but a shield? According to tradition, the loudest answers often come dressed in absolute silence. Today, we are going to open a forgotten journal, unclip a 20-year-old rejection letter, and uncover a terrifying, miraculous truth about a skyscraper built on a foundation of greed and the unseen hand of providence that pulled one man back from the edge of a crumbling cliff. The late afternoon sun caught the dust motes dancing in the silent architectural office. Elias stood at the center of the room, surrounded by 30 years of his life packed tightly into identical brown cardboard boxes. He was an aging architect, a man who had spent 3 decades preserving the structural integrity of other people's buildings, while quietly believing that the grand design of his own life had been abandoned by God. He reached for the bottom drawer of his heavy oak desk, the only one he hadn't yet emptied. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Elias pulled the heavy wooden drawer open. It resisted at first, its tracks stiff with disuse. Inside, resting beneath a pile of obsolete drafting templates, was a dark, leather-bound journal. He lifted it out, the cracked leather rough against his aging fingertips. It was heavy, weighted not just by the thick parchment pages, but by the gravity of an unanswered plea. When he opened it to the center bookmark, the first thing he saw was not words, but rust. A single, oxidized metal paperclip clung aggressively to the page, permanently staining the white paper with a dark orange bite mark. Clipped securely beneath it was a single sheet of official letterhead. It was 20 years old, yellowed at the edges, bearing the crest of the city's most prestigious development board. It was the formal rejection letter for the Eden Project, the massive, city-defining commission that Elias had believed, with every fiber of his being, was his divine calling. As he stared at the rusted metal, a shadow fell across his desk. A younger colleague, a junior partner flush with recent, lucrative successes, leaned against the doorframe holding a sleek tablet. "Almost done packing, Elias?" the young man asked, his tone carrying that specific, polite condescension reserved for those who have quietly faded into the background. "You know, I was just telling the new associates how much I admire you. You've had such a nice, quiet, stress-free career. Never taking on anything too big, never having to shoulder the crushing weight of those monumental skyline projects. There's a real peace in just staying in the safe lane, isn't there?" Elias offered a thin, polite smile. "Yes, it has been very quiet." The young partner tapped his screen, oblivious to the knife he had just twisted, and walked away. Elias turned his gaze toward the large pane-glass window. Miles away, piercing the hazy city skyline, the silhouette of the Eden Project loomed, but it was not gleaming. For the past 6 months, the massive towers had been completely shrouded in dark scaffolding and green mesh, stalled amid strange rumors of structural sinking and financial rot. Elias looked back down at the rusted paperclip. The younger architect's words echoed in his mind. A nice, quiet, stress-free career. If only they knew the violence of that quietness. If only they knew the deafening roar of the silence he had endured. The sacred wound in Elias's heart began to throb with a familiar dull ache. It was the ache of a soul who had dared to ask God for a purposeful burden, only to be met with a closed door. He had prayed, fasted, and prepared his blueprints with a reverent devotion, believing this was the work heaven had prepared for his hands. And heaven had simply said nothing. The rejection had come via sterile corporate mail, handing the project to his most ruthless rival. According to tradition, we often measure God's presence by what is miraculously given, forgetting to look at what is mysteriously withheld. But 20 years ago, standing in the ashes of his greatest ambition, Elias had felt only the crushing weight of divine absence. The rusted paperclip was the physical proof of his spiritual insignificance. He traced the embossed logo on the letter, his mind violently pulled back across 2 decades to the exact night his faith had fractured, and the exact moment the world had decided he was a man, devoid of God's favor. The air in the church fellowship hall 20 years ago had smelled sharply of stale coffee, floor wax, and well-intentioned pity. It was 3 days after the Eden Project commission had been publicly awarded to Marcus, an architect known more for his aggressive, corner-cutting ambition than his structural integrity. Elias sat near the back of the crowded hall, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, holding a white styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee. He was a man physically present, but spiritually hollowed out. He had shared his vision for the Eden Project with his church community. He had asked them to pray. They had laid hands on his blueprints, praising his dedication, assuring him that a man with such pure, faithful intentions would undoubtedly be elevated to a position of great influence. God, they had said confidently, would open the doors that no man could shut. But the door had been slammed shut, locked, and bolted. Now, sitting in the hard folding chair, Elias was experiencing the first, agonizing layer of spiritual exclusion. It did not come with shouting or malice. It came dressed in quiet, pious judgment. A senior church elder, a man who owned several successful car dealerships and equated financial victory with divine blessing, pulled up a chair beside Elias. The elder offered a rehearsed, sorrowful smile, placing a heavy hand on Elias's shoulder. "I was so sorry to hear the news, Elias. We all were." Elias stared into his styrofoam cup. "Thank you. It's difficult to understand. I truly believed this was the work I was meant to do." The elder leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a confidential, pastoral whisper. "You know, brother, the Lord's ways are mysterious, but He is also a God of order. He rewards those who are truly aligned with His will." The man paused, letting the silence stretch into an accusation. "Perhaps, and I say this in love, perhaps you didn't pray with enough faith, or perhaps there is some hidden compromise in your life, some unconfessed pride, that caused the Lord to remove His hand of favor from your work. God honors those who honor Him." Elias felt the styrofoam cup yield slightly under the sudden tightening of his grip. The hot coffee threatened to spill over his knuckles, but the physical heat was nothing compared to the sudden icy shock of the elder's words. This was the false explanation, the mistaken belief that infected the room. To the community, Elias's professional failure was not just a lost contract. It was a public indictment of his spiritual standing. If God had not blessed the endeavor, it meant Elias was somehow spiritually deficient. He was no longer the visionary architect. He was the cautionary tale of a man who lacked the faith to move mountains. Across the room, another group was quietly discussing Marcus, the rival who had won. Marcus rarely attended church, was known for his ruthlessness, yet he had secured the billion-dollar contract. God must be using Marcus to build His kingdom, someone whispered. He gives wealth to those who can handle the responsibility. Later Christian memory preserves the profound danger of treating divine favor as a transactional reward. Job's friends made the same tragic error, mistaking the painful mystery of providence for the punitive wrath of heaven. They looked at suffering and assumed sin. They looked at a closed door and assumed a curse. Elias did not argue. He did not defend his faith or his prayers. The micro-humiliation was absolute. He felt his dignity being quietly erased, stripped away by the very people who were supposed to hold him up. He stood up, carefully dropped the untouched coffee into a plastic trash bin, and walked out of the fellowship hall into the damp night air. He realized then that the exclusion wasn't just social. It felt cosmic. If this was how God operated, rewarding the ruthless while abandoning the faithful to the judgment of the pious, then Elias no longer knew how to speak to him. That night, the dialogue ended. The silence of heaven had deafened him, and Elias decided he would no longer humiliate himself by whispering into the void. The wilderness years did not come as a dramatic, crashing storm. They arrived like a slow, creeping frost that quietly choked the life out of the soil. Following the rejection, Elias retreated into the shadows of his profession. He took the jobs no one else wanted, inspecting foundational cracks in aging municipal buildings, retrofitting outdated plumbing systems, designing fire escapes for forgotten brick warehouses. He provided steadily for his family, but the visionary spark, the sacred calling he once felt beating in his chest, was dead. His spiritual life became an exercise in cold mechanics. He still attended services out of habit, standing when he was supposed to stand, bowing his head when asked, but his internal landscape was a frozen tundra. The intimate spiritual wound was not an active hatred of God, but something far more tragic. It was profound loneliness. It was the agonizing belief that God was real, sovereign, and entirely indifferent to Elias's existence. He believed he was a man who had simply slipped through the cracks of divine providence, a minor character written out of the main script. 3 weeks after the rejection, Elias had taken his leather-bound prayer journal, the one filled with pages of meticulous drawings, scripture verses, and tear-stained pleas for the Eden Project, and placed the rusted paperclip over the rejection letter. He put the journal in the bottom drawer of his desk, locked it with a small brass key, and tossed the key into a glass jar of loose screws and spare bolts on a high shelf. It was a deliberate, physical act of spiritual closure. He was locking away his hope, burying the evidence of his profound humiliation. As the years bled into decades, the injustice seemed only to magnify. The society around him constantly validated the false narrative of his failure. Elias would stand in line at the grocery store, waiting to pay for his modest groceries, and see Marcus's face smiling triumphantly from the covers of architectural magazines and business journals. The Master Builder. The headlines read, "Marcus and the Triumphant Rise of the Eden Towers." Every magazine cover was a micro-humiliation, a silent erasure of Elias's worth. Marcus was celebrated by politicians, applauded by religious leaders for his massive charitable donations, and heralded as a titan of industry. The world bowed to his success, cementing the narrative that God had indeed chosen the right man for the job. Elias, meanwhile, spent his afternoons tracing the rot in neglected drywall. Yet, there were faint, almost imperceptible hints of a hidden truth that Elias, blinded by his own grief, refused to see. Over the years, small news clippings would appear in the back pages of the local paper. Whispers of zoning violations, rumors of contractors not being paid, quiet investigations into the foreign investors funding the Eden Project. Elias always flipped past them. He thought it was just the normal friction of massive success, the kind of problems only great men had the privilege to face. He had normalized his despair. He had accepted his role as the unfavored son, the architect of small, broken things. He did not realize that we must be careful not to presume the mind of the Creator. God does not cause our despair, but He is infinitely patient, willing to endure our bitter anger and our heavy silence while He works in the absolute dark, weaving a safety net beneath a fall we cannot even see. Now, 20 years later, standing in his half-empty office with the unlocked journal in his hands, Elias was jolted back to the present by a sharp, vibrating buzz. His cell phone, resting on a stack of cardboard boxes, lit up with an urgent, breaking news alert from a major national syndicate. Elias glanced at it, expecting a weather update or a traffic warning. Instead, the bold black text on the glowing screen read, "Federal indictment unsealed. Massive fraud and structural failure discovered at Eden Project Towers. Lead architect faces decades in prison." Elias stared at the screen, the breath suddenly trapped in his throat. The frost that had encased his soul for 20 years began, imperceptibly, to crack. The twilight had fully surrendered tonight, casting the architectural office into deep shadow, save for the harsh, blue-white glow of Elias's computer monitor. He had not moved to turn on the overhead lights. He sat frozen in his desk chair, the faded prayer journal resting on his lap, his eyes scanning the endless streams of digital text, scrolling across his screen. This was the midpoint, the terrifying point of no return. The world as Elias understood it, the narrative of his failure, the certainty of his rejection, the theology of his abandonment was unraveling with every word he read. The federal indictment document, leaked to the press and published in its entirety, was 70 pages of unmitigated horror. The Eden Project was not a triumph of modern architecture. It was a colossal, decaying monument to human greed. The wealthy foreign investors who had backed the project were a front for a massive international money laundering syndicate. But the tragedy was not merely financial, it was structural. and Elias understood the technical language of the indictment better than any journalist. The documents revealed a systematic, terrifying compromise of the building's integrity. To siphon funds, the investors had violently strong-armed the architectural team into altering the blueprints. They had substituted high-grade, load-bearing steel for cheap, brittle alloys. They had drastically thinned the concrete foundation, ignored seismic retrofitting, and bypassed essential fire suppression codes. The towers were a death trap. Elias leaned closer to the monitor, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The proof was right in front of him. Witness testimonies from junior engineers, deeply redacted emails, and frightened confessions from contractors painted a picture of absolute coercion. The lead architect had been trapped. The documents detailed how the investors had leveraged the architect's reputation, threatened his family, and financially blackmailed him into signing off on the fraudulent safety reports. The architect had been a prisoner in his own glass tower, forced to build a tomb with his own hands. Elias scrolled down, his hands trembling violently. There, at the center of the indictment, listed as the primary defendant facing federal racketeering, fraud, and criminal negligence charges, was the name, Marcus, the rival who had taken Elias's dream, the man the church elders said was blessed by God, the man who had been featured on the magazines. He was entirely broken, his legacy destroyed, his future reduced to decades behind federal bars. Elias pushed his chair back from the desk, gasping for air as if he had been submerged underwater for 20 years and had just breached the surface. The paradigm shift was violent, earth-shattering. He looked down at the leather journal in his lap. He looked at the rusted paperclip holding the rejection letter. God honors those who honor him, the church elder had said. A profound, terrifying awe washed over Elias. The hidden truth struck him with the force of a physical blow, the no that had broken his heart, the silence that had frozen his faith, the rejection that had caused him decades of humiliation. It was not an abandonment. It was a violent, forceful rescue. If Elias had won that contract, with his unyielding integrity and refusal to compromise, he would have been the perfect, naive scapegoat. The syndicate would have crushed him. They would have destroyed his firm, ruined his family, or forced him into a criminal conspiracy that would have destroyed his soul. It is not that heaven orchestrates the ruin of others to save one man. Rather, grace occasionally builds an invisible wall to keep a pure heart from walking off an already crumbling cliff. The evil of the Eden Project was born of human greed, a trap laid by corrupt men. God had not set the trap, but he had categorically refused to let Elias walk into it. The silence of God had been the shield that saved his life. Overwhelmed, feeling the walls of his office closing in on him, Elias grabbed his coat. He couldn't breathe. The sacred anger that had defined his life was dissolving into something far heavier, far more terrifying. Absolute, unearned grace. He fled the office, walking out into the rain-slicked city streets, needing the cold air to anchor him to reality. He walked aimlessly, guided only by the blinding shock of the truth, until he found himself standing under the awning of a quiet, dim cafe just 2 blocks from the federal courthouse. The bell above the cafe door chimed a hollow, brassy note as Elias stepped out of the cold rain. The diner was nearly empty, smelling of burnt espresso and wet wool. Neon light from the street lamp outside bled through the horizontal blinds, casting long, prison-like shadows across the linoleum floor. Elias walked toward the counter, his mind still reeling from the documents, when he stopped dead in his tracks. Sitting alone in a corner booth, hunched over the chipped laminate table, was Marcus. For a moment, Elias thought his mind was playing a cruel trick, but it was him. The confrontation was not a planned ambush. It was a collision orchestrated by the unseen hand of time. There were no reporters here, no flashing cameras, no church elders offering platitudes. Just 2 aging architects in the dead of night. Marcus looked terrible. The man who had graced the covers of magazines was gone. His hair was thin and stark white, his skin pallid and sagging with the weight of unspeakable stress. He wore a rumpled, expensive suit that now looked too large for his shrinking frame. Elias slowly approached the booth. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know if he should feel anger, pity, or vindication. He just stood there until Marcus slowly raised his head. Marcus's eyes, red-rimmed and hollow, locked onto Elias. There was no flash of arrogance, no defensive posturing. The public humiliation had completely stripped him of his armor. Elias, Marcus whispered, his voice raspy, like dry leaves scraping across pavement. What are you doing here? I was just walking, Elias said quietly. He slid into the booth opposite Marcus. Between them sat a white ceramic coffee cup, a haunting reflection of the styrofoam cup Elias had held 20 years ago in the church hall. Marcus stared at the dark liquid in his cup. His hands were trembling so violently that the coffee rippled. Have you seen the news? Marcus asked, his voice devoid of hope. I read the indictment, Elias replied. His voice was gentle, lacking any venom or triumph. The truth was too heavy for cheap revenge. A ragged, agonizing sigh escaped Marcus's chest. He leaned his head back against the vinyl booth, closing his eyes. They owned me, Elias. From the very first day, the investors, they didn't want an architect. They wanted a signature. They wanted someone ambitious enough to take the bait, and arrogant enough to think he could control them. Marcus opened his eyes and looked directly at Elias. The revelation was about to be spoken aloud, not by a priest or a prophet, but by the broken man who had taken the prize. You know, Marcus said, his voice breaking. 20 years ago, when I won the bid, I pitied you. I looked at you and thought you were a fool for being so cautious, so bound by your morals. I thought the world belonged to men who were willing to bend. Marcus reached out, his trembling fingers tracing the rim of the coffee cup. But they wouldn't let me build it right. Every time I tried to enforce a safety code, they threatened to ruin my firm. They threatened my wife. I spent 20 years building a monument to my own damnation. I haven't slept a full night in a decade, waiting for the foundation to crack, waiting for the FBI to knock on my door. A single tear slipped down Marcus's weathered cheek, catching the neon light. The cost of institutional neglect, the price of spiritual blindness, was laid bare in the weeping eyes of a broken man. I used to pity you, Elias, Marcus whispered, the words carrying the full weight of a confession. But looking back, I realize you were the lucky one. Whatever stopped you from getting that contract, whatever kept you out of that room, it saved your life. You were protected. I was destroyed. Elias sat in absolute silence. The words washed over him, sealing the fractured edges of his soul. His hidden truth was now a public reality, validated by the very man who had been the instrument of his pain. Elias reached across the table and placed his hand gently over Marcus's trembling fingers, stopping the shaking. It was a gesture of profound mercy. He did not lecture. He did not judge. The moral reversal was complete, and Elias understood that true justice did not require Marcus's destruction. It only required the truth to be known. I'm sorry, Marcus, Elias said softly, and he meant it. He paid for the coffee, stood up, and walked out into the clearing night, leaving the cafe with a soul entirely altered. The rain had stopped by the time Elias returned to his architectural office. The city outside his window was quiet, the heavy clouds breaking apart to reveal the faint, pale light of the approaching dawn. He did not turn on the overhead lights. He didn't need them anymore. He walked slowly to his desk, his footsteps feeling lighter, as if a physical weight had been surgically removed from his spine. He sat down and pulled the leather-bound prayer journal toward him. The restoration of Elias's dignity was complete, but it had not come in the form he had once imagined. There was no grand public apology from the church elders who had judged him. There was no sudden influx of wealth or late-in-life fame. The divine vindication was entirely internal, quiet, and infinitely more powerful. He realized now that his life had not been an accident. His modest career, his quiet existence, his uncelebrated integrity, it was not the result of God's rejection. It was the architecture of providence. For 20 years, he had believed he was standing outside the gates of blessing, banging his fists against a locked door. Now he understood the truth. God had placed him inside a fortress, and the locked door was the only thing keeping the wolves at bay. His prayers had not been ignored. They had been translated. He had asked for success, and heaven, in its terrifying, severe mercy, had given him survival. He thought of the people who had judged him, the community that had equated worldly triumph with spiritual purity. He felt no anger toward them anymore. Their view of God was simply too small, too transactional. They could not comprehend a love so vast that it was willing to break a man's heart to save his soul. Some sources suggest that true spiritual maturity is not found in receiving everything you pray for, but in standing in breathless awe of what you were saved from. Elias had finally arrived at that awe. With slow, reverent movements, Elias reached down to the open journal. He placed his thumb against the rusted metal paperclip that had stained the pages for 2 decades. With a gentle push, the brittle metal snapped, breaking its hold. He lifted the yellowed, 20-year-old rejection letter from the book. It no longer looked like a symbol of humiliation. It looked like a shield. It looked like a love letter from a father who had stood in the doorway, blocking the path to destruction, absorbing the furious blows of his child without ever stepping aside. Elias smoothed out the creases of the old paper. He walked over to the large pane glass window. In the distance, the doomed Eden project stood in the shadows, a dark monument to ruin. But the rising sun was beginning to hit the glass of Elias's office, filling the room with warm golden light. Elias placed the faded rejection letter carefully on the sunlit windowsill. He let his hand rest there for a moment, feeling the warmth of the morning sun against his aged skin. He smiled, a quiet, peaceful expression that reached the corners of his eyes. He turned away from the window, picked up his coat, and walked out of the office, leaving the cardboard boxes behind. He was stepping into the rest of his life not as a man who had been forgotten by time, but as a man who had been meticulously, fiercely protected by the silent, unseen hand of God. The silence in his heart was no longer an empty void. It was filled, completely and eternally, with grace. Elias's story invites us to re-examine one of the most painful experiences of the human condition: the agonizing silence of unanswered prayer. We are often conditioned by a culture of immediate gratification, and sometimes by well-meaning but misguided spiritual communities, to view divine favor as a transactional reward. If we succeed, God is blessing us. If we fail, we must somehow lack faith or favor. But the architecture of providence is rarely so simple. Some sources suggest that true spiritual maturity begins when we stop measuring God's love solely by what He gives, and start looking closely at what He actively withholds. The rejection Elias suffered was excruciating. It cost him his reputation, his confidence, and 2 decades of inner peace. Yet, it was precisely that rejection that preserved his integrity, his freedom, and his soul. This narrative challenges us to look at the ruins of our own lives from a different vantage point. When a relationship unexpectedly ends, when a career opportunity collapses, or when a lifelong dream is suddenly handed to someone else, our immediate reaction is often grief, or even sacred anger. That grief is valid, but history, and later Christian memory, preserves a deeper truth. Grace occasionally builds an invisible wall. It does not orchestrate the downfall of others, but it will fiercely protect a pure heart from walking into a trap of its own making. Perhaps the most profound faith is not found in the courage to ask for what we want, but in the humility to accept that we do not always know what would destroy us. Silence is not always an absence. Sometimes, silence is the heaviest, most impenetrable shield we could ever be given. Thank you for walking through this journey of faith, memory, and profound revelation with us. If Elias's story resonated with your own quiet struggles, please leave a like, share this video with someone who might be sitting in the heavy silence of a closed door right now, and subscribe to our channel to join our growing community. We would love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever experienced a painful rejection or a deeply felt unanswered prayer that, years later, you realized was actually a hidden blessing or a vital protection? Share your story below. Your journey might be the exact encouragement someone else needs to read today. And make sure you have your notifications turned on, because in our next video, we will explore a forgotten diary found beneath the floorboards of an old church, a profound testament that challenges everything we think we know about true forgiveness. You won't want to miss it.